I am a radio listener. I like listening to the radio. I listen to a lot of NPR, but I'll listen to a lot of different things on the radio. One of the things that I like about the radio is voice quality. And I do think a lot of the people that work for NPR have really good voices. I mean, people talk about having a good radio voice. But I think there is something that comes across on the radio about the sound of the human voice that you don't get in film, and you don't really get in life, because you get a lot of other information when you're listening to people speak. But when you're listening to the radio, you just hear the human voice. Billy Collins was on the radio yesterday, and he was talking about radio, and he said when he thinks about the radio, he'd mentioned the radio in one of the poems that he wrote, and he said when he thinks about radio, he thinks about the 1950s. He has an image of the 1950s, and he thinks that radio is a more romantic medium than television, which I thought was pretty interesting. And he was being interviewed, and both he and the interviewer agreed that radio was a really good medium for poetry because of the emphasis on the human voice, but also that you don't know what the voice is about to say, and because you don't have any visual cues or clues, you can be taken more by surprise by the content, the spoken content. So Billy Collins was saying that he really likes to read poems and deliver poems on the radio because he thinks they're really effective in that way. The Irish are very superstitious, and there are lots and lots of ghost stories in Ireland. People believe in all kinds of strange things in Ireland. They certainly believe in healing. They believe in miracles. They believe in what over here are called leprechauns, which are nonsense, but they do believe in invisible people, or what they call the little people. There's a story about an old Irish woman who was asked one time whether she believed in the little people, and she said, "No, I don't, but they're there." And that's kind of the way I believe in ghosts. I don't really believe in ghosts, but I do think they're there. I'm not sure that I've had some encounters, I think, that have been psychic in some way, but I've never seen a ghost, and I'm not sure that I would want to, really. So now what you're going to have to do with your video is try to catch an image of a ghost. They may. I don't know of ghostly places. I've never heard of ghosts in Atlanta, which is strange because we're living on battlefields.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people killed right where we are. The people killed, I'm not sure right here, but certainly very close, within half a mile of here. There was a program on TV one time about ghosts, and one of the ideas, they were ghost hunters, they were people who were interested in strange phenomena, and one of the ideas they were trying to deal with or explore was that somehow a ghost was sound, and the sound could be registered somehow in a place or in stone, and then it could live on somehow in that dimension. I mean, it's hard to know what on earth a ghost is or how a ghost stays around. The people that I've known who've seen ghosts are frightened by them, which I think is, I suppose I take it as some kind of evidence that they really did see something. But also it's a bit disturbing that ghosts would always be frightening. They certainly have ideas, you know, in any locality, in any particular area, there would be places that people wouldn't go after dark. And sometimes it might be because they thought they were haunted, that they would, you know, there might be a ghost there. But other times they would avoid a place because of the fairies. What's different, and actually you get it again in Shakespeare or Elizabethan times, the fairies are not always considered to be nice. they're dangerous, and they can try to capture you. They particularly, what the fairies were often interested in Irish stories were capturing children and babies. But one of the things that comes up fairly commonly in Ireland is that musicians have had encounters with fairies. Because traditional musicians, and there are a number of them, who will say that they've had an encounter with a fairy and they learned a tune from a fairy. And there are some tunes, traditional Irish tunes, that are said to have been given to musicians by fairies. But there are places out in the country, the Irish, for instance, you'll see a hawthorn bush, which is a thorn bush, with beautiful white flowers in the spring. And you'll often see a bush like that in the middle of a field, and the farmer will not cut it down. It's very, very bad luck to cut a bush like that down, because it's associated with the fairies. The fairies are supposed to dance around it or live under it. So there are all kinds of... It's one of the reasons that there are archaeological sites out in Ireland that remained undisturbed for hundreds and hundreds of years, because farmers would not dig up the sites or get rid of the stone or plough the site under into their field. In England they would have done that. They wouldn't be that worried about it, but because the Irish were often so superstitious, they would be, they would have the idea that if they did that, something terrible would happen. And then they would tell stories about bad things happening. Strange birds coming, to visit. Or there's a lot of bird imagery as well, and messages delivered by birds. And they believe in holy wells and all kinds of people who have strange powers with animals. And there's a story told in Monaghan. My uncle told me a story of a man who had power over foxes, and he could go to a fox's den and he could reach in with his hand and he could pull a fox out. Now normally if you did that, the fox would scratch your hand to pieces or bite you, but foxes trusted him and he could reach in and pull them out. Everything was fine. But several weeks later my mother told me about something that happened that night in the inn that she didn't want to tell me while the trip was going on, because she said my father and she were lying in their bed, in their room, in the inn, and she woke up and my father was sitting up in the bed and he was saying his prayers. Saying prayers sitting up in bed. And my mother said to him, and he looked very scared, and my mother said, "What's wrong?" And he said, a woman has just walked into the room, and she was wearing a white nightdress, a very old-fashioned nightdress, and she sat down at a table in the corner of the room and started combing her hair, brushing her hair, I suppose. And my father spoke to the woman, and then he realized pretty quickly that he was seeing a ghost. Now my father did have a sixth sense, and he'd seen a number of ghosts in his life. So I believe that it happened.